The wind howled across the frozen expanse, a spectral voice shrieking through the jagged ice formations that clawed at the storm-dark sky. Even through the reinforced fabric of his cold-weather suit, Eric Vasquez felt the bite of the wind like 1,000 tiny needles pressing into his skin. It wasn't just cold, it was the kind of cold that killed. The transport ship had barely touched down before the storm rolled in, blanketing everything in a swirling whiteout. Eric and the other human exchange students struggled to follow their guide through the blizzard, their visors icing over faster than their thermal systems could compensate. Leading them with steady, confident strides was Instructor Zal-Kir, their VA theory mentor, wrapped in the thick, sinewy furs of some native beast. The towering alien moved through the snow as if it were a mere inconvenience, while the humans stumbled like newborn calves on an unforgiving tundra. "This is the reality of Ghartol-Va," Zal-Kir's voice crackled through the comms, deep and guttural. "Your fragile human bodies were never meant to endure it. Your tools will fail. Your technology is meaningless here." A flare of irritation bubbled up in Eric's chest, but he held his tongue. He had already read Zal-Kir's dossier, one of the most accomplished survival instructors of the VA theory race, renowned for his unshakable belief in the superiority of his species' survival methods. Their arrival at the VA theory outpost was almost an afterthought, the cluster of low, ice-etched structures barely visible beneath thick layers of permafrost. By the time the human team stumbled into the main shelter, shaking the ice from their gear, Zal-Kir was already standing before them, arms crossed, tusked face unreadable. "You believe your human technology makes you adaptable," he said, his sharp, slitted eyes scanning them like an executioner weighing their worth. "You will learn otherwise." Eric and his teammates exchanged looks, some defensive, others uncertain. The outpost was lit by faint bioluminescent lamps, casting eerie blue shadows over the walls. The VA theory used a mix of geothermal heat and organic insulation, primitive by human standards, but undeniably effective. "Let's not get ahead of ourselves," said Dr. Evelyn Carter, the senior human scientist on the team. "We came here to exchange knowledge, not to prove who's superior." Zal-Kir let out a guttural click, the VA theory equivalent of laughter. "Then let us begin with a simple demonstration." With a single swipe of his massive, clawed hand, he placed a solid block of permafrost on the table. It was dense, packed hard as steel by centuries of wind and pressure. "Your tools. Your methods," he said, gesturing. "Prove to me that your technology is not worthless." Eric stepped forward, confidence surging. "All right," he muttered. "Let's do this." He pulled out his plasma cutter, a compact industrial-grade tool designed to slice through rock, ice, and even some metals. He activated it, the blue-white beam flaring to life with a hiss. He pressed the beam against the permafrost block. Nothing. The ice didn't melt. It didn't even scorch. Instead, the plasma cutter's temperature monitor plummeted, warning lights flashing across the display. The extreme cold of Ghartol-Va was draining its energy too fast, rendering it useless. Zal-Kir's mandibles twitched in something close to amusement. "Your technology fails before the first lesson even begins." Eric's jaw clenched as laughter rumbled through the VA theory observers. The other humans shuffled uncomfortably. The alien instructor had made his point loud and clear. "1 week," Zal-Kir said, voice firm. "You will survive on your technology alone. You will hunt, you will build, you will endure. And when you fail, as you will, only then will you be worthy of true teaching." The doors to the shelter slid open again, letting in a gust of frigid air. "Now go," Zal-Kir ordered. "Prove to me that humans belong here." Eric didn't argue. He simply gritted his teeth, clenched his useless plasma cutter, and stepped back out into the storm. And in the back of his mind, a single thought burned. There has to be a way. The wind never stopped screaming. Eric Vasquez huddled inside his emergency shelter, a compact survival pod designed to withstand extreme cold, except it wasn't designed for this level of cold. His breath fogged the air, his thermal suit struggling to maintain warmth as the howling storm outside pounded against the reinforced walls. The challenge was simple: survive 1 week using only human technology. But after only 12 hours, it was clear that simple was a damn lie. The plasma cutters were useless. Their heating elements failed faster than they could function. The drones? Frozen solid. Even the advanced insulation of their gear wasn't enough against the unrelenting deep freeze of Ghartol-Va. Status check, Eric muttered into his comms. Static. Then a crackling reply from Dr. Evelyn Carter, the senior scientist. Barely holding. The portable generators keep stalling out. And the VA theory are watching us. Closely. Eric didn't need to look outside to confirm that. Even through the walls of his pod, he could feel their eyes, predatory, judging, waiting. Zal-Kir and his warriors had already decided the humans would fail. Now they were just waiting to see how fast. A flicker of movement outside caught Eric's eye. He peeked through the frost-covered viewport and saw two figures, his teammates, Raj and Kelly, struggling to haul supplies through the snow. The ice beneath them groaned ominously. A bad feeling slithered into Eric's gut. Watch your footing, he barked into the comms. Raj barely had time to react before the ice cracked beneath him. A deafening snap rang out as a massive chunk of ice gave way, plunging him into the darkness below. Raj! Kelly shouted, scrambling toward the edge. Eric was already moving. He grabbed the rescue line from his gear, barely pausing to secure it before launching himself toward the collapse site. Ice groaned under his weight as he reached the edge and looked down. Beneath the jagged break, Raj dangled by his safety harness, breath steaming in the frigid air. His legs kicked over black water, an abyss of unfathomable depth. Hold on! Eric shouted, lowering the line. Raj struggled to grab it, fingers stiff from the cold. Hurry, he gasped. There's something down here. The water moved. A flicker of bioluminescence glowed beneath the surface, shifting, twisting. Something alive was watching. Eric's stomach tightened. Raj, grab the line. Now. Raj didn't hesitate. He latched on, and Eric hauled him up with a grunt, muscles burning. Kelly scrambled to help, and together they dragged Raj onto solid ice, collapsing in exhaustion. For a moment, they just breathed, shivering in the bitter wind. Then Eric looked down at the hole Raj had nearly vanished into. Water. Liquid, moving water, despite the lethal cold. Eric's mind spun. Every VA theory lesson, every arrogant dismissal from Zal-Kir, every sneering remark about human ignorance, it all clicked into place. The VA theory hunted by vibrations, searching for creatures beneath the ice. But they never fished. They never touched the water. They assumed nothing could survive down there. But they were wrong. What if? Eric whispered, voice barely audible. Kelly frowned. What? What if we've been going about this all wrong? Eric turned to Raj, eyes blazing with sudden inspiration. We've been fighting this planet like it's trying to kill us. But what if we work with it instead? Raj coughed, rubbing warmth back into his fingers. Not sure I follow, man. Eric stared at the dark, shifting water below. The VA theory think our tools are useless, he said. Let's prove them wrong. And with that, he grabbed his gear and started planning. Because if there was life beneath the ice, then there was a way to survive. The next morning, the storm had faded, leaving a stillness that felt almost wrong. The wind was a distant hum, but the cold was just as unrelenting. Eric stood at the edge of the crack in the ice, staring down into the depths below. The water shimmered with an unnatural glow, an eerie, bioluminescent pulse that seemed to call out from the abyss. Raj and Kelly stood a few feet behind him, exchanging doubtful looks. It was clear they didn't fully understand Eric's plan, but the desperation in his eyes was enough to get them moving. All right, Eric muttered, more to himself than to them, we're going to fish. Kelly raised an eyebrow. Fish? On an ice planet? You can't be serious. Eric didn't respond at first. He was too busy organizing their supplies, a thermal lance, the last of their exhausted power cells, and the rigged heat emitters they had managed to salvage from the failed plasma cutters. The idea was simple: generate enough warmth to attract whatever creature lurked in the frozen waters below. Humans had always been resourceful. In the face of failure, they adapted. And this planet had one thing no one had counted on: life beneath the ice. "Just trust me," Eric said, plugging in the heat emitter and positioning it above the ice. A faint warmth spread, barely noticeable against the surrounding chill. He nodded to Kelly. "Get the line ready. We're going to need something to pull it up once it takes the bait." They worked in silence, their breath crystallizing in the air. The tension hung like a blade over them, cutting through the quiet. Each of them knew what was at stake. If this didn't work, they were out of options. Their survival would be in the hands of a planet that seemed hell-bent on destroying them. The first signs came almost immediately. The water beneath the ice began to stir. At first, it was just a ripple, a barely perceptible shift in the liquid's surface. Then, the bioluminescence below pulsed faster, drawing closer to the warmth of the emitter. "Something's coming," Raj said, his voice low. Eric's heart raced. He had no idea what to expect, but he was sure of one thing: this was their only shot. The faint glow below grew brighter, more intense. It wasn't just one creature. It was a swarm. Eric adjusted the emitter, carefully fine-tuning it to maintain the exact temperature needed to keep the creatures from fleeing. "Now!" Eric shouted, and Kelly threw the weighted fishing line onto the ice, where it quickly fell into the gap. Moments later, the water erupted. A massive creature broke through the surface, its sleek, scaled body flashing in the eerie light. It was long and serpentine, with multiple tendrils that swayed with unnatural grace. Its eyes, a deep, glowing red, locked onto the heat signature, right where the line had sunk. "Get it!" Eric yelled. "Now, Kelly!" The line jerked hard, and Kelly scrambled to secure it, nearly losing her footing. The creature thrashed beneath the ice, its sleek form twisting as it fought against the pull. For a moment, it looked like they might lose it, but the struggle was exactly what they needed. The creature writhed and screeched, its massive body breaking through the ice, water spilling out in torrents. Finally, with a sharp snap, the creature was hauled onto solid ground, its massive body heaving with each labored breath. The group stood frozen, staring at the bioluminescent creature, a fish, but nothing like any they'd ever seen before. This is insane," Raj whispered. "We actually did it." Eric took a deep breath, his eyes fixed on the creature. The shock of the catch had worn off, but the weight of the moment was just beginning to settle in. "This is just the start," he said, turning to face his team. His voice was calm, but there was a fire in his eyes. "We've just proven that life survives here. If we can figure out how to work with it, we can survive too." But just as he spoke, a familiar, chilling voice interrupted. How quaint. It was Zal-Kir, standing a few meters away with his arms crossed, his cold gaze fixed on the struggling creature. The VA theory instructor's massive frame seemed to fill the space, his presence a looming shadow in the pale light. "You've caught your pet," Zal-Kir said, voice dripping with disdain. "But it's nothing compared to what we've survived." Eric's heart sank. He hadn't expected approval, but the venom in Zal-Kir's tone was harder to ignore than he'd anticipated. "You're wrong," Eric shot back, his frustration boiling over. "This is just the beginning. We'll show you that human ingenuity can adapt to any challenge, even one as hostile as this." Zal-Kir raised an eyebrow, his tusked face betraying no emotion. "Then prove it." And with that, the alien turned and walked away, his furs billowing behind him as he disappeared into the snowstorm. Eric stood frozen for a moment, the weight of Zal-Kir's words pressing down on him. The doubt lingered in the air, but something else had changed too, he could feel it. He'd caught the first sign of hope on Ghartol-Va. It wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about proving something, about showing the VA theory that humans had more to offer than the cold alien world could ever imagine. Eric's hands were shaking, not from the cold, but from the adrenaline still coursing through his veins. They had done it. Against all odds, they'd caught something from the ice, proof that the alien planet could sustain life, even in its harshest conditions. The creature, now subdued and tethered to the ground, twitched occasionally, still alive but disoriented. It was a surreal moment, standing there in the deepening twilight, as the three humans stared at the creature, trying to process what they'd just accomplished. The wind howled around them, but the quiet was deafening. "How did you even think of this?" Raj asked, still staring at the creature, as if expecting it to wake up and speak. Eric wiped the sweat from his brow, the cold biting even deeper as his body cooled from the exertion. "The ice, it's more than just a barrier. It's alive, in a way. If we can figure out how to interact with it, work with it instead of fighting it, this planet might give us a chance." Kelly crouched beside the creature, carefully inspecting the glowing patterns on its skin. "What do we do with it now?" Before Eric could answer, a sound like a distant rumble made him freeze. It was low, almost imperceptible, but there was no mistaking it, a thrum coming from deep below the ice. The creature, still alive but sluggish, twitched again, reacting to the vibrations beneath them. Then, the ground beneath them shuddered. "Do you feel that?" Kelly whispered, her hand pressed to the ice. Eric's pulse quickened. "It's not just the creature. Something's moving down there." The rumble grew louder, the vibrations traveling through the ice like shockwaves. Eric stood, scanning the horizon for any sign of danger, but all he could see was the unbroken expanse of white. Suddenly, the ice cracked with an awful, grinding sound. A deep fissure split the ground beneath them, the crack reaching out in jagged lines like a spider's web. The warmth from the heat emitter they'd used earlier was fading, and the water below was once again plunging into the abyss. Then came the noise. A deep, guttural roar from beneath the ice, shaking the ground as if something massive was pushing against it. The rumble intensified into a growl, then into a roar that echoed off the ice walls, reverberating deep into Eric's bones. "Get back!" Eric shouted, grabbing Raj and Kelly, pulling them away from the crack. They barely had time to react before the ice split open again, wider this time, and from the gap, a massive shadow began to emerge. Eric's heart raced as the creature, a Ghartol-Va, the very thing the VA theory had warned them about, broke through the surface of the ice. Its body was a terrifying serpent-like mass, covered in thick, armored scales that glistened in the pale light. The creature's size was beyond anything Eric had ever imagined, its head alone the size of a small ship. Eyes that glowed like molten embers blinked, focusing on them with deadly intent. "This is what we were warned about," Kelly whispered, voice trembling. "Run!" Eric shouted, pulling them away from the massive predator. But the Ghartol-Va was already moving, its great body undulating with impossible speed for its size, the sheer force of its movement splitting the ice beneath them. "We need to bait it away," Eric said, heart pounding. "We can't fight it head-on." Raj's face was pale, eyes wide with terror. "You're insane. That thing will crush us. We don't have a choice." Eric snapped. "We lure it away. Use the thermal decoys. Anything to get it moving in the other direction." They rushed back to their gear, scrambling for the last of their heat-emitting devices. The Ghartol-Va was still closing in, its massive jaws snapping open and shut, ready to devour anything that moved. Eric hurled one of the decoys into the crack, the heat signature flaring to life as it fell into the depths of the fissure. For a moment, there was nothing, just the sound of their ragged breathing and the pounding of their hearts. Then, the ice rippled again, and the Ghartol-Va shifted, its gaze now locked onto the decoy. With a deafening screech, the creature began to move, its enormous tail swiping across the ice with terrifying force. Eric didn't wait to see if it was working. He pulled Kelly and Raj behind a thick outcropping of ice, hoping it would be enough to shield them from the creature's wrath. The ground shook with the Ghartol-Va's movements, but they held their position, praying the decoy would hold its attention. Minutes passed like hours. The creature's growls and thrashes echoed in the distance. Then, finally, the rumble began to fade, the sounds of the beast's pursuit growing quieter. Eric let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Did we make it?" Raj asked, his voice hoarse with fear. Eric stared out at the vast, silent ice field, his chest still tight with adrenaline. "For now." But he knew this wasn't over. They had managed to survive one attack, but the Cthulhu wasn't the only danger this planet had to offer. And as they huddled together, still shaking from the encounter, one thing was clear: they were not alone on Ghartol-Va. The day after the Cthulhu attack, the icy wasteland around them felt even more oppressive. The sun barely crested the horizon, casting a faint, pale glow over the landscape, but it did nothing to warm the frigid air. The wind had died down, leaving the world disturbingly quiet, the only sound their own breathing as they moved through the snow. Eric, Raj, and Kelly walked in silence, their footsteps crunching in the deep snow. Behind them, the remnants of their thermal decoys lay scattered across the ice, the faintest hint of heat still clinging to their shattered remains. The Cthulhu had followed them for hours after the first bait had been dropped, but eventually the beast had retreated into the ice, retreating into the depths from which it had come. It had left behind a warning, a reminder of how fragile their position was. "We need to make camp," Eric said, breaking the silence. "We can't keep running forever. We need to find a way to survive long-term, or we're not going to make it." Raj nodded, his face drawn. "We barely made it out of that last mess. I don't know how much more of this I can take." Eric paused, giving him a hard look. "We're not going to die here. We just need to think. We need to find a way to adapt." The ice was their enemy, but it was also their ally. The life beneath it was proof that the planet could sustain them if they could learn to use it. They had already demonstrated they could capture one creature from the depths. Now, they needed a way to keep it alive and use its resources. "I'm thinking about something we haven't tried yet," Eric continued, his voice steady with resolve. "The thermal vents. The VA theory used them, right? We need to find one of those and use it to our advantage." Kelly shivered at the thought of more heat, but nodded. Better than freezing to death. They set out again, the horizon stretching endlessly before them, but Eric's eyes were fixed on the task at hand. They were all exhausted, physically drained from the constant tension, emotionally battered from the Cthulhu attack. But survival demanded action, and action was what they needed. Several hours later, they came across the faintest signs of a geothermal vent, an irregularity in the ice where the surface shimmered in an unnatural way. Their pulse quickened, but Eric held up a hand to stop them. "Stay quiet," he whispered. "We don't know what's below yet." They crept closer, crouching low to the ice. The heat signature of the vent was faint but detectable. Eric carefully pressed his hand against the surface and felt the barest warmth radiating through the ice. It wasn't much, but it was enough to build on. "I'll go first," Eric said, after a long moment. "You two stay back. If anything happens, pull me out." Raj looked skeptical, but nodded. "Just be careful." Eric's breath came out in a cloud of vapor as he knelt and began drilling into the ice, using the last of their tools. The drill bit chewed through the frozen surface, sending tiny chunks of ice flying. He felt the pressure build, the low hum of the geothermal energy vibrating through the ground beneath him. He reached the core, and the ice above began to crack under the force of the heat. Slowly, carefully, Eric broke through the frozen surface to reveal a pocket of warm gas rising from the earth below. It wasn't much, but it was enough to sustain them for a while. "Got it!" Eric shouted, his voice echoing across the ice. Kelly and Raj rushed over, their faces a mix of relief and disbelief. Together, they started setting up a makeshift shelter, reinforcing it with the remnants of their equipment and using the vent's warmth to keep them alive. They worked quickly, knowing this was their best chance to regroup and strategize. As they settled in, a low thrum sounded beneath them again. Not the Cthulhu, but something else. The ground was shifting, and the ice groaned under the weight of something massive. "Eric," Kelly whispered, her voice tense. "Do you think it's—" "No," Eric said sharply. "The Cthulhu is gone. It's something else." Then, from the shadows of the horizon, a figure appeared. Not one of the VA theory. This was different, tall, slender, and silent, moving with the grace of something that had adapted to this frozen world long before the humans had arrived. For a moment, Eric's heart skipped a beat. He had no idea what this was, but one thing was certain: it was not friendly. We need to move, Eric said, his voice urgent. Get to the shelter, now. They didn't question him. Raj and Kelly grabbed their gear and followed Eric as they sprinted toward the protection of the vent. But the figure moved with them, its long, thin body a blur against the snow. This was the moment when their fate on Ghartol-Va would be sealed. Would they learn to survive together? Or would the alien forces of this planet swallow them whole? The shadow loomed over them, tall and alien, its silhouette flickering against the snowy landscape like a ghost. The ground beneath Eric's feet seemed to pulse with an unsettling energy, the very ice vibrating in response to the creature's presence. He didn't know what it was, but one thing was clear: it was no ordinary life form, and it wasn't here to play games. Stay back, Eric muttered, his voice low and steady. He could feel Raj and Kelly move behind him, instinctively falling into formation. They'd learned quickly that caution and silence were often their only allies in this frozen wasteland. The creature, if it could be called that, was like nothing Eric had ever seen. Its body was long, lithe, and semi-transparent, as if its form had been carved out of the very ice it moved across. Its limbs were elongated, with joints that bent in impossible angles, and its skin seemed to shimmer with an inner light, refracting the pale glow of the distant sun. But it wasn't the creature's appearance that unsettled Eric. It was the way it moved, graceful, purposeful, yet utterly alien. Eric reached for his comms, his hand shaking ever so slightly as he tried to keep his voice calm. We need to observe it, not provoke it. Raj, Kelly, get the scanners. Raj didn't hesitate. He pulled out the last functioning scanner they had and aimed it toward the creature. The device emitted a soft beep, and the creature paused mid-step, as if aware of the signal. It's reacting to us, Raj said, his voice tense. It knows we're here. Eric kept his eyes locked on the creature. It didn't move toward them, but it didn't retreat either. Instead, it seemed to be studying them, its eyes, if they could be called eyes, glowing with an ethereal, almost curious light. Then it made a sound. A low, sonorous hum that vibrated through the ice, setting Eric's teeth on edge. The creature tilted its head, its body swaying with an almost hypnotic rhythm. It wasn't threatening, but it wasn't friendly either. We need to make contact, Eric said, his voice resolute. We can't just run from this. Kelly shot him a skeptical glance. You're not suggesting we talk to it, are you? Eric didn't answer right away. He was already moving forward, slowly, deliberately. His instinct told him that aggression would lead to nothing but death. They had tried to fight the Cathuan, but all that had earned them was a reminder of how far out of their depth they were. This was different. This creature wasn't like the Cathuan, it wasn't here to kill them. As he approached, Eric extended his hand, palm outstretched, showing no weapon, no threat. He wasn't sure if the creature would understand, but he had no other choice. This planet, its dangers, and its mysteries were not going to give them the luxury of time to figure things out. They needed answers now. To his surprise, the creature stopped humming and tilted its head further, as if processing his gesture. The air around Eric seemed to shift, a subtle warmth spreading in the space between them, though the temperature hadn't changed. I think it's listening, Kelly whispered, incredulity in her voice. Eric nodded, his heart pounding. But just as quickly as it had approached, the creature shifted away, its limbs moving in a graceful arc as it retreated into the shadow of a nearby glacier. Wait, Raj said, but Eric shook his head. No. Let it go. We've made our contact. Let it decide if it wants to communicate. They stood in stunned silence for a moment, watching the creature disappear into the ice. The ground settled back into its unnatural stillness, and the wind seemed to pick up again, howling across the frozen tundra. Did we just, Kelly started, but Eric cut her off. We just made a connection, he said, his voice steady, though his mind raced. I don't know what it means, but we can't afford to ignore it. If that creature understands us, if it's willing to communicate, then it could be our key to surviving here. To learning how to thrive on this planet. But how? Raj asked, his brow furrowed. How do we even begin to understand it? Eric's eyes hardened with determination. We adapt. We don't just survive, we learn. The VA theory have their ways. But we have ours. And we're not going to fail. Not anymore. He turned and began to walk back toward their makeshift shelter near the geothermal vent. The air felt different now, less hostile, less like a tomb. They had made it through one trial, and they had done it on their terms. They weren't the helpless humans that had stumbled onto Ghartol-Va. They were survivors. We'll set up a research station, Eric continued, his mind already working. We'll study the creature, study the ice. We'll learn how to use the planet's resources, not just survive it. Kelly and Raj exchanged a look, and for the first time since their arrival on this godforsaken ice world, there was something like hope in their eyes. They hadn't just proven their survival, they had proven they could adapt, they could change the game. Eric knew they weren't alone anymore. The planet had a way of working with its inhabitants, if you knew how to read its language. And that was exactly what they were going to do. Together, they would learn to survive Ghartol-Va. And maybe, just maybe, they could prove to the VA theory that human ingenuity could outlast the ice.